there was like a 2-week period that like the world was ending. We were done. It was over.
I remember the world ending. It was a very stressful time.
You're one of them. It was like the communist scare. Like he's Nido. That's it. Talk to me about your stance on biosecurity. I realize that can be a 2-week conversation, but
sure.
give me the minute or two. Yeah, and then let's talk about that a little bit. Let's yeah.
Okay, so before I met Jessica, biosecurity was not something I thought about. I am a certified medical assistant. I was that before I became a stay-at-home mom, so I do have like a general understanding of like cleanliness and washing your hands and like basic stuff that everybody needs to do. But biosecurity for reptiles was not on my radar. I had heard, because you try when you first get into the hobby, you get so excited and you're trying to absorb all this information from all the different channels and avenues, and there was so much of it because it was COVID. So
right.
I had seen now my brain's gonna go blank. He's in California. He just started his own like rack company. Help me out. He had a Nido journey that he recorded.
Oh, I gotcha.
Pack racks.
Oh, pack racks. Yeah. Gotcha.
So I had seen his little. He had like vlogged his journey with Nido, but it was so taboo, and it was so like everybody was like, oh, now you can't buy from him, and so it was just like the scary monster that you talk about around campfires, like the ghost story, and it didn't seem real. It seemed more like a fairy tale, and so that's kind of like that was the amount of information I had when I started hanging out with Jessica more. And she is very passionate about biosecurity. She's very passionate about disease testing. It is her heart and soul. And there is no middle ground. There's no, like she's just very. Isn't he in Georgia? Is he in Georgia? I thought he was in California.
I met him in Daytona, but maybe he came all the way from California. I'm not sure.
Jessica's always right. This I have learned, so we'll just let her be right because she usually is. So
okay, we'll go on the safe bet then.
For sure. So, she's very, like I said, she's very black and white about it, and I have never been a very black and white person. And so, but when you've come out of the gate, she was trying to talk me into testing my collection before it got too big. And I think at the time I had like 40 adults and like a lot of grow-ups and babies and stuff. And so she was trying to like do it now before it's too late or before you get too big, or, like she's very passionate about it because she has lost her collection twice.
I was going to say, what was at the root? So this is experience with infections, with fatal infections.
Right. And so if you go back and you watch our very first introduction episode, we tell our stories, and she talks about her story. So when she was young, she was breeding boas in her bathroom as a teenager, like just how freaking amazing is that? And so she had boas in, 2000. So 20 years ago, and they didn't know about diseases. They didn't have disease testing. They were just starting to talk about it, but there were no options. There was no swab. There was nothing to be done at the time. And so by the time she started losing animals, they had started talking about the diseases, and she does her story much more justice. So please go and listen to our first episode if you want to hear Jessica's story. But because of that, she ended up losing her whole collection of boas, and these, basically had like grown up through high school with her. So they were like her best friends. Yeah. And all of us reptile nerds know, like, these are our buddies too, and
right.
So it was a very traumatic.
Was she able to pinpoint what that first, infection was?
According to my remembrance, I don't think they had the technology to
do that.
So it wasn't like a typhoid Mary. It was just like all of a sudden snakes started rolling and there was no way to test the rest. And so she didn't want to pass that plague on to other people, and they have live births. So it is completely transmitted to their babies. So then she couldn't breed anymore. And so it was just like there was really nowhere to go from there because we didn't have disease testing like we do now.
Yeah.
And so then she didn't come back for a long time. And then she re-entered the hobby and she was doing like there was testing and she was like, okay, I think I can do it, you know, because that was very traumatic. You know, like when you lose your whole collection that you've had since you were, you know, a very young age.
Yeah.
And so she decided she was going to come back, and she wasn't hardcore about it. And so there was like, she had gotten them from somebody before and they had tested negative, I think is what happened. And then, like I said, she tells her own story. I'm not doing it justice, but she had another incident where she had to euthanize a bunch of her collection again.
Yeah.
And so now there's no room for her to be any different. And that's not my personality. But when I had a snake die right after it had laid eggs, and the snake just happened to be named after my daughter's best friend. So she was a really important snake. And at this time, you know, it's COVID. We're all at home. We're all very involved in the business. My girls have named every single snake. You know, we're holding all the snakes all the time. Like, I mean, this is a very hands-on point in our business. You know, it's life has slowly trickled back into normalcy. You know, like I'm doing a lot more than I was at that point. They were all helping. Mm-hmm. And so it was a very traumatic thing for my kids to lose one of the snakes that they really loved. And, you know, you tell people, oh, my snake laid and a week later was dead. And she's like, Jana, that's Nido. Like, please send that off for necropsy and start testing your stuff. Mm-hmm. And, you know, like I said, it was my kid's best friend she named her snake after her best friend. So of course there was like the whole funeral service and, you know, like the crying. And I'm like, that snake's already buried in my backyard, you know, like, I mean, there was nothing I could do about it, but I had swabbed the snake before we buried it. And so I had sent it off, and of course it was positive for Nido.
Wow.
And so at that point, it's like, you're already in it. Like I had been in it a year. And I had invested, you know, I think at that point, probably like 8,000 to 10,000.
Yeah. Big money.
Was big money to me. I mean, I've since invested way more than that,
sure.
But at the time, like I had robbed Peter to pay Paul because my ex was not behind me at that point. Like I hadn't proved that it was a viable thing. And he was like, you can do it, but you got to do it with this and make it whatever you can with this, you know, like, And so, you know, because I was a stay-at-home mom, so he's bringing in the money, and I got. So like, I'm not gonna hand you $20K to go have fun with when I have no idea what you're doing. Like, you want to have a snake business, really? Like, it sounds insane, right? Which we all know that it is insane because we're all doing it. But
we're doing it, but it's
It also there's validity in that, but I hadn't shown him that, and he wasn't digesting the information at a rate that I was. And so I knew that I was fine, but then I had a snake positive for Nido. And at that point he was like, you've spent this much money and you have this many animals and you weren't disease testing. And so, I mean, at that point I'm like, you're right. You know, like what the heck am I doing? I wasn't protecting our investment. I wasn't protecting our business. And so I just kind of had like this meltdown moment, and I was like, I need to just stop and start testing, because I was just like willy-nilly just out there like everybody else is, bringing snakes in, you know, like you do the 3-month quarantine, there's no respiratory infection, you're good to go, you know, like just standard stuff. That is how I had learned online. And so, I mean, that was a really awful, gross month of my life, trying to test everybody. And luckily my husband was like, we got to protect our investment. It was like $1,000+ to test everything. Right? Yeah. But he was like, we need to just know where we're at. Like, are we going to burn to the ground, you know, $10,000, or are we okay?
Right. What did you find? Had it spread to other animals or so? Well, and sorry, let me back up too, just to play devil's advocate. And I agree with your premise. Let me make that very clear. I agree with the premise. But to play devil's advocate, I hear of Nido, I hear of more companies making testing available, and I get skeptical when I hear of suddenly there's new products that cost money, and now there's this problem over here that wasn't talked about before. So there's this like skeptical, like, wait a minute, are the people that are invested in this project the same people creating the problem? And to hear you say that you actually had Nido arrive, that's a different level of validity than I've come across. And listen, I completely, I think the Gobbles did a fantastic video on
They did a
Nido.
great video.
And him being a doctor, a veterinary doctor, brought a lot to the table and really got my attention on it, versus every person out there on the internet suddenly being an expert on Nido. Like, oh, there was like a 2-week period that like the world was ending. We were done. It was over. Like,
I feel like we contributed to that a little, and it was not intentional. But yes, I remember the world ending. It was a very stressful time.
It was like you couldn't, you weren't allowed to ask a question like, well, how does it work? And I'm like, well, you're one of them. It was like the communist scare, like he's Nido. That's it. But no, I thought that the Gobbles did a very good job on that. And so now back to, what did you find? Had it spread? Was it mostly contained? What was the ramifications of that?
So the very first phase of testing is I tested everybody in that female's breed group.
Okay.
And then I tested all of my males, my breeder males.
And now we're just talking Nido here, and there's many other viruses.
Yeah, just talking Nido.
Issues. Yeah, you're just talking Nido. That's spread by, am I right, salivary contact. So it's not,
right.
It's not flying around the room. It's not
flying around the room.
It's not here right now kind of thing. It's not that.
No, it's not flying around the room. It is actually like the least scary of the diseases.
But if
there's
for feeding tongues, if you fed one snake that struck this that had Nido, now you've got that salivary.
And you can pass it. If you pick up a rodent, now you're putting it on that rodent, and then they eat that rodent, even if it's frozen thawed. If they're eating that rodent, then they're taking that into their body, and whether or not they get it or not, it's like we don't have hard science on how contagious it is, but that is how it is spread. And so, just to like really quickly, because you said the Reader's Digest, and I'm giving you the like lifelong 3 hour.
No, that's why I'm interrupting you. It's okay. I'm envisioning that I'm the 8th child to the 9th, and we're just going to jump in. And I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off. What the hell happened with the test? Did you?
Okay.
So did they get more or not? Where did it go from there?
So I ended up, I believe, having 6 positive at that time.
Wow. Okay.
And they were the other members of that breed group. And so the other breed groups, the males all tested negative. And so because when you don't have those results and you're waiting for those results, you imagine the worst. So I've had a positive at this point, and now I'm doing the next round, and I'm like, it's all going to come tumbling down, and I've got my angry husband, and like, which, I mean, very valid on his point. He's like, why didn't you know about this?
Like it was 10 grand and poof.
Exactly.
Like
and so, so it was very like, I couldn't even open it. I had to send it to Jessica, and I was like, please open it and just let me know if it's, because we knew there was going to be a positive because I'd already had a positive. And so I was just like, just tell me if it's real bad or if it's going to be okay, and so like, sometimes she's my like test buddy opener, because sometimes I can't do it, but it was really, I expected it to be really, really bad, and it wasn't. I was really grateful. I was really lucky. 6 sounds like a lot when you only have 40, but like I said, that the investment into those animals was very minimal compared to some of my other projects. Now
you already faced in your mind, from the way you're describing it, you'd already faced the worst. So that wasn't as bad of news.
Right. And so one of the snakes happened to be my very favorite snake, my best buddy, like the snake that, like the ambassador snake of my collection. And so he was breeding. So we had thought he was female. So he had been in the same breed group as that female that had died. But then I had found out, because it was my first season. So, so then they'd like beat each other up. So obviously, like, saliva had been passed.
Yeah.
And then we found out he was male. And
they were having spit fights. Yeah.
Correct.
I'm sorry to joke. Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I'm fine now. So he had a single female that he was breeding to because he was my favorite. And so, of course, he had infected that female. And then the male, and that's 2, and then his 3 females were all had it. And so that group of 6. But the female that my favorite boy was breeding to was already at like 22. She was far enough along in the breeding process, and they had no symptoms, that I actually ended up keeping them in their own quarantine. They had their own rack. They were in a different part of the house because I really wanted one of his babies. And I also kind of wanted to see, because they can be asymptomatic, and long-term, like it's not good to keep them long-term, but there is someone who has a long-term Nido positive colony who is studying it. She's a doctor.
Interesting.
I had kept them until they laid, but none of the babies hatched. They all died of incubation. So anyway, at that point, when you first experience Nido, you get very passionate about it.
Right.
When it's your favorite snake.
Well, that's what I wanted to get to the core of, was because we're all creatures of our own experiences and our own life. And sometimes it takes that experience to learn and not have to go through it yourself.
Exactly. It's what you want to prevent from other people, which is why we wanted to do a podcast where we normalize it and normal everyday conversation. And so I was very hardcore when we first started, and I've kind of settled into a place that I'm comfortable. So, Jessica's, I feel like she's out here and there's nothing wrong with where she's at. And she's very like, everyone has to test, everyone has to get on board. And I love her and I support her. And I think that she needs to continue to have that passion and put that into the industry. I love biosecurity. I think people should test. But I've kind of settled into where I settle with most things, where I'm like, I'm going to tell you about it, and you take what's valuable to you and you decide for yourself. Like, it's not my job to tell you what you have to do. It's just my job to provide a story and to encourage you to not experience what I've experienced in a way that feels like the best fit for you, because it's not going to look the same for everybody. Like, there was an interview that someone did recently, and the person was talking the whole time about biosecurity and about how strict his biosecurity methods are. And he has a big factory, and like, they changed their gloves, every level of their rack. And like, they just had all these awesome things and all these buzzwords that we like to hear on our podcast about biosecurity. But when you ask him about testing, he's like, testing's stupid.
Yeah.
But for me, I want to hear that someone's doing the biosecurity more than I want to hear that they're testing. But for Jessica, and I shouldn't speak for her. Sorry, Jessica, you can yell at me later. For her, she wants both. And that's fine. Like I said, like,
I think it takes both personalities. There's got to be, like, I have this, and I won't say where because I don't want to turn this into politics. I have a buddy that he and I see the world through a very similar lens. We agree. We're preaching to each other's choir. But let me tell you, that guy is going to go get in your face and say, you need to believe this, or I'm going to go, I believe this, and I got to go live my life the best way that I can.
And that's absolutely where we should be. That's how I feel about everything. Like, I have very passionate beliefs for myself, but my passion is not your responsibility.
That's true. That's true. And like, hopefully we're all doing good, but let's get specific. So, because I have a couple specific questions as well. And then Kent in the audience brought up a question earlier. So your background is medical, which is far more important than my background of food. However,
hey, there's different lessons to be learned.
Well, we both are in the only professions that are allowed to give people something to put into their bodies. Mm-hmm. And when I tell that to my teams, I don't care if it's day one and they've never been to culinary school, or if they're a chef that's been at it 20 years, if there's something that shouldn't go in somebody's body, it's in the trash. And honestly, if they produce it twice, they're probably out the door. You can't mess around with that stuff. So one question that comes to mind for me is, or in food and beverage anyhow, and in the food safety world, it's about mitigating things, because every person's body reacts different to things. So you might react differently to shrimp than I do, and might react differently to somebody who goes into anaphylactic shock.
Correct.
I'm guessing every living species has that sort of spectrum of reactions to things or a higher level of natural immunity. We saw some people never get COVID. We see people like me have vaccines, boosters, and I still get it. So I'm guessing what I'm saying is that I feel like there's got to be there's ways to mitigate it. And I think there's ways to perfect it, but to truly perfect it, you have to live in a bubble. So my question is, and we can circle back to any other topic in there too. How does the world of vending, so you're out of your bubble, you're way out of that bubble, you're interacting greatly with, you don't know if this 4-year-old was just bit by the last banana that she picked up.
Or that they were holding a snake that has crypto or any number of other things. Yes.
Right.
So this is, like I said, like where Jessica and I sometimes don't see eye to eye because.
So how do you live in the world of, and maybe does Jessica vend as well or not?
She does, but she is meticulous about, like, she has very stringent procedures that in order for her to feel comfortable vending, she has to follow all these protocols.
Gotcha. Okay, so talk to me about, and like you say, let's be fair to Jessica, let's not put words in her mouth.
Sorry, Jessica. I always try to talk for her, but
for yourself, what just like quick fire, can people hold your snakes, and if they do, so how does that work?
Fire, I prophylactically treat for mites. Before I go to a show, every snake, as I'm boxing them up to go to a show, gets treated for mites.
And what do you use for that?
Frontline, but it's going out. It's gone. So we are in the middle. Mostly Jessica and I are looking at. She's going to get the information and she's going to give it to me, and I'm going to do like a trial of a new product. We talked about it in our last episode about. The carrier agent for diluting down Frontline. And anyway, so we'll be talking on that more on our show, but so irrespective of that, as I treat everything because
so you're treating for mites.
I'm treating beforehand.
For mites. Okay.
Beforehand, everything goes with me down to the show. I have a specific snake that I call my show snake. It's a cinnamon male named Teddy Bear. It's my 4-year-old snake. But about half the time, he goes and stays with a good friend of mine who I vend with that makes earrings. So this is the snake.
I was going to ask about
go ahead. The tribute,
yeah.
And he has his own enclosure at my house that's not in my racking system. He has his own enclosure at my friend's house. she does not breed snakes, and so he is not with my collection.
So he's in personal quarantine.
He's basically always in his quarantine. Yes.
Yeah.
And so he's like the typhoid Mary sacrifice snake. So to be, anyway, so he's the one that I mostly let children hold. He's very calm. He doesn't get stressed out at shows. He's never struck. He's just a very mellow, sweet, personable snake. And he has sold me a lot of snakes.
Cool.
So
right.
A lot of people who are really heavy into biosecurity do not let people hold, or if they let people hold, they must wear gloves.
Yeah.
So I do not do that. I make them sanitize before and after, which sanitizer does not kill crypto, just FYI. But in order for me to be myself, and in order for me to go to the show and be genuine to who I am and to what I represent in the world of reptiles, I have to let kids touch snakes, because that's where my passion starts from. And that's what gives me energy to continue to be a breeder. And so, I really wrestled with this because, like I said, Jessica's very black and white, and she's like, you got to have them put gloves on. And it's like, I had already been to a bunch of shows and I had already been doing it differently before I learned about biosecurity. And so for me, I'm like, I can't go to the show and be this totally different way. Like, that's not why I'm at the shows. And so I do have the sacrifice snake, and he's an amazing snake. And, also being on the outside of your booth and letting kids interact and make that, initial contact in their brain of a positive experience with a reptile. You're also communicating with parents, and you're educating about reptiles. You're handing out business cards. You're opening the door in a really positive way. And for me, that's why I'm at the shows. I'm also at the shows to sell the snakes that I have that are, under 500, but I'm really there to get a reptile into somebody's hands in a positive way
Yeah.
for maybe the first time, or someone who's afraid. Like I get so many people that come to my booth, they're like, I'm afraid.
Terrified,
I've never held a snake, and I pull out, and his name's Teddy Bear. Like,
right.
How can you not want to hold him? And he really is just the sweetest thing. And so, you know, like I've helped so many people like take that first step to not be afraid anymore.
Yeah.
And so for me, like I'm so passionate about that. And that's what gives me the energy to be there and to sell all those snakes.
Yep.
Is those moments. And so I couldn't be the kind of person where I'm like, you have to have gloves on, you know, nobody's touching unless they're buying, you know. And then I'll have one or two like not expensive babies. If someone is like looks more like they're going to actually buy, I have a few that I'll take out and let them hold until they've decided which one they want.
Yeah.
And then your protocol when you come back is you need to have like basically like a quarantine. So I have out in my new snake shack, I have a baby rack. And in my house, I have a baby rack. They're identical. And so when we come back from a show, like I have my holdbacks and stuff, and they're out in my shop. But when I come back from a show, those babies go. And so basically, because it was show season, my ones that go to travel to the shows have been inside. And my holdbacks and the rest of my collection are out in so they're like not even in the same building.
Right. Let me ask you, and thank you for going through that. Like that's clarifying to me. How many or what level of concern, or however you want to quantify it, we talked about is it mostly spread with contact, or is it going to be spread with air is really what I'm asking. I suppose.
Depends on which disease you're talking about. So
sure. And so
crypto,
talk us through some of those challenges or
okay,
the variations.
I'm not the world's smartest on diseases. So the reason that if you want to be safe at a show and free from any diseases coming home, 100% safe and 100% assured in what you're doing, then that's why you would want to only let people touch or hold that are going to buy, having gloves on, because crypto can be on the table that you set up on your display on. If somebody sets down their phone on someone's table that has had an animal out that has crypto, that crypto is on that surface and it will transfer to another surface. And when you put on hand sanitizer, that does not kill crypto. So it is still transferable through multiple touching contacts to your animals.
So as I see, here's what I'm wrestling with personally as I prepare. I think I have not vended shows before. So my bubble I talked about, boom, things come in, they get quarantined, but then nothing, the way that light's emanating from back there, nothing goes in there unless it's been quarantined and I'm keeping it.
Right.
I got a hatchling rack out here, and then this grow out sort of stock rack of what I'll sell or might make it to hold back.
Right.
Like those, they got a chance, but you could get them from me for the right price kind of thing.
Right. So I have that too. And all the stuff that's out in my shed is like the stuff that's where your light is coming from. And then the majority of my babies that might eventually trickle over to the shed is in my house. So
to me, I know it's not perfect. I do the medical hands in, hands out. What, you know, if I go in that room, my hands have been washed. If I come out of that room, my hands are getting washed again.
So your own collection is a whole different animal than a show.
But that'll be show stock, and where I have an opportunity to keep show stock, like that's where that light's coming from is fully enclosed, and my garage loops around that way. So like, do I need but the problem is everything's going to be in this garage is the reality of it. So does separating it farther apart help?
So
or
if
am I
things that are on different walls, those are far enough apart. It depends on your biosecurity. So when we say biosecurity, we mean what are you doing between each animal? So if you say you're feeding frozen thought and you take your tongs and you offer a rodent to a snake and they don't take it, you know, do you immediately open up the next one and do you feed it to the next one, which is what most people do, right? And so if you have bio zones, security zones, so hatchlings have a very low risk of having diseases because they haven't been exposed.
They haven't exposed to the world. Yeah.
They're not exposed to the world. Nido does not transfer to the eggs. And so they have very little experience. They've never been bred. There's very little chance for them to have encountered someone who is infected water. So if your babies have Nido, then your biosecurity is a mess and you've got a whole other problems on your hands, is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
So they are the lowest risk category. So if, say, you have a set of tongs for your babies and you feed your babies in one go, that is a biosecurity bubble, like a biosecurity zone.
Right.
So,
and I consider that for my room back there. So
your adults are a biosecurity zone.
Yeah.
So I feed my adults on a different night than I feed my babies, because then I'm not worrying about saliva being on my clothes. I'm not worrying about touching an adult and then coming and touching a baby. So you would never interact with your adults and then interact with your babies. You should always interact with your babies and then your adults, if you have to do it on the same day. So you go from the lowest risk category to the highest. You never go from the highest to the lowest. And that's what we mean when we say biosecurity. So do you have to go to the level that every animal has their own tongs? I don't think so.
Right.
I like to do bubbles. I like to break my things up on days. So I'll clean my babies on a different day than I clean my adults. I'll feed my babies on different days than I feed my adults. And so you're just not, like I said, you don't want to interact with the highest risk group and then move to your lowest, because then you're introducing risk factors to someone who shouldn't have risk factors.
I see. That's an interesting point. I hadn't considered that before. The contact, the order of contact, I would even say I'm skeptical of gloves from a food service standpoint. Because if you got a glove on and you contaminate it, it doesn't matter how good that glove is, it's contaminated. It's just as contaminated as your hand is going to be, So
the reason that most people who are in the biosecurity habits use gloves is because they can be removed and you can remove those germs with them and throw them away. So if you have crypto out there in your land of existence within your colony and you sanitize between every snake, you're not killing that crypto. So, but if you have a glove on and you're switching your gloves, within your groupings. So most people go a further step. So they take their adults and they break them down.
Let me interrupt one thing. I got to push back on one from a food safety standpoint. If a health inspector sees me change a glove without washing my hand, I get knocked.
So you do want to wash your hands. So
let me
break it down for you.
There we go.
Once you take your gloves off, you absolutely want to wash hot
That's
water.
The key point. Yeah.
And then you want to put on new gloves.
That's right. Okay.
You don't want to use sanitizer because that's not going to be enough with the diseases.
Right. You want a full wash.
It will be fine for Nido. Just a sanitizer, but it doesn't kill other things. So anyway, So if you have biosecurity bubbles, so people who are dealing with their adults, some people treat it like every man's an island, and some people do it by breed groups. So say you have a male and he's going to 6 females. If one of those females doesn't take that rodent, you can offer it to anybody else in her breeding group.
Oh, interesting.
Because they're all being exposed to the same male.
Right.
And so that would be an acceptable level of risk because they're also going to be in a tub with that male. So people break it down by breed groups. And so you'll have smaller chunks. And so if you're cleaning, you'll clean that breed group. And if you want to keep that breed group as its own little unit, that's when you would change your gloves. That's when you take your gloves off, wash your hands, and put on a fresh pair.
There you go.
But there's that other level where everybody's an island. It just depends on the level that you need to take it to feel safe, to feel secure, because
those are those levels of mitigation. Yeah.
I can't live like that. So I do have breed groups. I'm not going to change between every single snake. I'm not going to have a pair of tongs for every single snake. I just can't function at that level. That's too high of a stress for me. So I do the best I can. I have, like I said, I have different feed days. I have different clumps. So I do mine by breeding groups each year. I do mine by the adults. The males are the highest risk for Nido because they're interacting with the most other snakes or older females. And so you just have to be aware on how you're handling and making sure you are sanitizing between each snake. I mean, you just have to, like, there's so many layers that you can peel back, and you have to find where you're comfortable.
Right.
But I do test every snake on intake. They do sit in quarantine for at least 3 months, and they are tested a second time. But the reason why a lot of people advocate against testing is because a snake can have Nido, but not have a high enough level of the infection to trip the test. So, like, we like to test after, like, high stress events, so shipping. So if they had it but it wasn't high enough to read, so say somebody tested it before they shipped it out, it could test negative, but then I could get that snake 24 hours later and it's had this high stress event, and its immune system is depressed, and then you test again and it could test positive. Or after a female lays their eggs, that's a great time to test, because prophylactic testing within your colony, if you are a tester, is a good idea. So, like, if there was ever a female that just kind of seemed off, you just get to, like, especially if you experienced it, like I've actually experienced it. So I can sometimes just look at a female and be like, I'm going to test her just because she just kind of seems off. And it might just be that she's off, but like, I have seen a female die from Nido. So I kind of know what I'm looking for. Just like if you've seen somebody with a snake with a respiratory infection, you kind of know what it looks like even at the very beginning, or they start acting in an odd way and you're like, I think that snake's going to get sick. You know what I mean? Like, you just learn your animals and you learn how to tell these things. And so I do test on intake. I do test after 90 days. And then I test when I feel like it's pertinent. And so I feel like, for me, and then I have my biosecurity zones. And for me, that gives me a level of, like, I've done my due diligence. I feel okay. I can go to sleep at night. And other people, it needs to be a lot higher than that. And then there are other people who don't feel like they need to test at all, but they have this very stringent biosecurity habits. So they feel like they have all these little micro zones of safety. And so for me, it's like, what do you need? It's real. It happened.
It's real. It is that. Yeah.
It's not a boogeyman story. It's a real thing in our industry. If you look at other animal husbandry industries, they have very stringent viral practices. There was a video that we had shared in one of our episodes a while back where they, like, step in sanitizer before they enter a room.
Yeah.
And that's in other animal husbandries, like, it's just a no-brainer. Everybody does it. In our industry, it's not a no-brainer for some reason, but it is very normal for animal industries to have diseases. How we act and treat those diseases defines our industry. And
it'll define the future of our industry. Yes.
And the future of our industry. And right now, especially with USARK and all the laws that are trying to be passed, I mean, you're in Florida, right? Like,
it's the Wild West. Like,
Wild West. It's like, if we can't do this, if we can't regulate ourselves, then they're going to regulate us. And so if they decide to go after, the diseases that are in our communities, and we haven't regulated ourselves, like, that's a point of attack that they could come in and be like, you guys aren't educating yourself. All the other industries are regulating themselves. You know what I mean? And so there are levels, and you have to decide where you are in the level. I want people to know that, like, it is real. I'm not a Karen. I've never been a Karen. That is not my personality. But it is real, and you need to protect yourself. And so, like, I can't tell people every person needs to test, or, like, there was this big blow up with Billy up in Mutation Creation. He's got thousands of snakes. It does not make any sense for him to test thousands of snakes. Should he have biosecurity bubbles in place? Absolutely, he should. Should he have his babies who are zero risk in the same room as his breeder females or breeder males? No, and he does it. Yeah. And so it's like, there are levels based on your own collection, based on how many different species you have, based on, where you're buying from. Or if you're bringing in, 50 snakes a day from Craigslist, you're high risk, but there's so many levels, and it's such an intricate thing that you have to do your research. You have to decide what you're comfortable with, because it is a business. There is money behind it. I
think just thinking about it and coming up with you can't just arbitrarily come up with your own definitions, but to a person. So for myself, for example, I'll talk about Tito. When he's out of town, I take care of his ASFs and his snakes. But by going to his facility, I was able to gain confidence in how he handles what he does and me take in animals from him. I buy from a breeder. He's the only breeder I bought from for a long time now, but I've gone to his facility. Oh, he's got separate colonies and separate buildings. Hey, I like this. We're thinking about it. Are we going to be perfect? Probably not, but we're thinking about it, you know? And so I think anything that we track and focus on is going to get better.